now let's focus first on the unemployment rate, which is 23%, 23.1% across Nigeria. So what that is telling us, because we look at the sectors that have the capacity to employ. The key sectoral drivers of production and GDP growth in Nigeria include construction, manufacturing, and then these are the sectors that have been hard hit by the recent recession. In fact, the real estate sector hasn't fully recovered from the recession, so meaning that a lot of people, because these are all very high labor intensive sectors that employ a lot of people. So when they are not performing at an optimum, so you expect that the job performance will be low. Employment will actually be very low. So that is actually the key drivers. Manufacturing, construction, real estate are still in recession. And actually agriculture has also started to drop, even though it was performing well during the recession, but now it has started to lose steam. So that is telling us that those drivers are not really performing. So as long as they are not, then we don't expect the employment figures to be very positive.
So there are many variables that tie up to adding to the fact of what makes one a functional member or a recognized member of Nigeria's labor force. Help us to understand the key factors.
Okay. So to be in the labor force, let's look at the age, okay, from 15 to 64. So that is the labor force. Okay, now when you decompose that, you now have the employed and the underemployed and the unemployed. So what is the percentage of people who are unemployed? And then for that, it would mean somebody who is in the labor force between the age of 15 and 64, who is looking for a job, especially over the preceding week that the statistics, the data was taken, and then was looking for a job, couldn't find one, or didn't work for at least 20 hours. So when that is the case, then the person is put as an unemployed person, regardless of whether the person is underemployed, I mean, employed below the qualification or not earning the right wage or something like that. So, but when somebody is employed below the qualification or not earning the right wage that is supposed to earn at a particular qualification, then we refer to such as an underemployed person. But again, there is that is the ILO, International Labour Organization, definition of unemployment that most countries use, and I think that is what the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics uses. But then we will not also, fail to recognize that there is what we call disguised unemployment. Okay, where somebody may be employed. It is actually something below underemployment. These guys, just people are busy because they have nothing else doing. So they try to, create the impression that they're doing something, but actually... So
busy now is not the same thing as being employed?
Well, yes, they are busy. They are employed, they are engaged, but actually it doesn't add up too much.
And we should at this point highlight the
difference.
difference.
So that is what is called disguised unemployment.
Disguised unemployment. So we should at this point highlight the difference also between the fact that you could be legally employed or illegally employed, and being a part of the labor force means that you are legally employed.
Well, labor force, yes.
You contribute to the GDP.
To be part of the labor force means that you are legally employed. So your production or your output is part of the GDP, is part of the GDP computation. So that means that you are legally employed.
So generally now across the report, we are seeing states with higher number of underemployed being the states with seasonal agriculture. And you and I were having this conversation prior to the beginning of the show. Given this trend, should we not at this point begin to consider institutional changes or policy changes whereby even if the states have to rely, like the South-South region where they are oil rich, but they still come the tops when you consider the number of the unemployed within the country. They do have agriculture, a lot of greenery that they could fall back on. But we have to look in the light of institutionalizing policies that would help ensure that season in, season out, year in, year out, the employment figures are interesting, so to speak.
So when you talk about agriculture, which is affected by seasonality, so people produce, go to the farms, especially during the rainy seasons, and then during the harvest. Now, off that season, they are not employed. So that is when perhaps if there were good policies, and then if the manufacturing, especially agro-allied industries, have active processing, and then storage facilities. If we had such infrastructure, definitely that will smoothen the employment all through the season, not just having this cyclical nature of employment in those agrarian states. But the failure of infrastructure policies, to drive the necessary changes required to make that happen is the reason why we experience that.
Shall we go back to why in the first place oil-rich regions fall short of creating jobs for the population?
I think that, again, speaks to the resource cost. Nigeria is a victim, of course, because we are dependent on oil, and we failed to activate or catalyze other sectors of the economy. The same thing can be said of, could be said of the oil-rich states, like Bayelsa, River State. So they have failed because I think everybody is engaged in this battle to control the oil resources. So they have not really done much because, again, they depend solely on what comes. Remember the derivation, the huge amount of allocation that they get from the federal government. So that compensates for anything. So there is no incentive. And then we know that government has never been a good creator of job in any system. It is the private sector. But because those states are focused only on what comes from the federal purse, the derivation formula, I think that is sufficient for them. But again, it is inefficiently redistributed, and that is what leads to the high level of unemployment.
So conversely now, you look at a state like Lagos, which tops the list in terms of states that created the most job for the period, Q3 18 till now. Yes. And then also tops the list of the states with the number of unemployment, rural urban migration.
That's very understandable, of course. So Lagos is the only state, in fact, I think Kaduna is warming up right now, but Lagos seems to be the strongest state when it comes to creating jobs. They have so many policies that activate the private sector, incentivize the private sector to create jobs. And I think it is a job of the private sector to create jobs, not the government, because we end up having an over-bloated civil service. That is the part of the problem of the Nigerian system and of all those states. So the state has just a certain limited carrying capacity for job creation. And again, when you look at job quality, the jobs created by the state do not demand for high level of skills. So it is not the route that any state should go. Lagos State, I think, performs well in creating jobs or enabling the private sector to a certain extent to create jobs. Or the infrastructure still remains a huge bottleneck in job creation in Lagos. But they have done over the past couple of years, they have taken some policies, some initiatives. We know the Employee Trust Fund, where they advance some low or free interest loans to SMEs who employ people. So these are all incentives to galvanize the job creation, and they've done well on that. And by the way, in 2016, I think the federal government, under the office of the vice president, engaged some consultancies, Dalbeg, working with the office of the vice president to produce what they call the National Job Creation Strategy. Actually, I don't know what has become of that.
So